Hello, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. So today we're discussing the infamous Donald J. Trump. Now, in the past decade, we have seen the former United States president rise and fall right before our very eyes. And many people are still confused at how, a personality and figure like Trump managed to win a spot at the White House in the first place, how he managed to stay in power so long despite his impeachment trials, and what comes next. In this video, I want to explore Trump's rise, his term, and his fall, and I want to do this through looking at populism. And specifically, I'll be focusing on a strategic/discursive performative approach to populism. So already, you may be asking, well, what is populism? By definition, populism is a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel their concerns are disregarded by established elite groups. In political science, populism is the idea that society is separated into two groups at odds with one another. So on one side you have the pure people, and on the other side you have the corrupt elite. And these are both at odds with one another. A populist leader often claims to represent the unified will of the people and stands in opposition to an enemy often embodied by the current system, which happens to be the elite. So basically, the populist leader stands in opposition to the corrupt elite and tries to sort of align themselves with the people in order to sort of galvanize people and unite them against the common enemy, which is the elite. So, how do you spot a populist? Well, it's hard to narrow it down because every populist leader embodies populism slightly differently. And I'm aware that I'm going to say populism a lot of times throughout this video, so feel free to keep a tally. But here are three main characteristics that Benjamin Moffat cites in his book, The Global Rise of Populism. So, number one, they will often perpetuate a state of crisis. Now, this is a huge part of populist leadership. So because populism is all about, standing with the people and opposing an enemy, which is often embodied by the current establishment and system, this means that a populist leader who gets into power is essentially forced to be in a permanent campaign because they have to convince their people that they're not the establishment and never will be. And this is made difficult when a populist leader, gets into power because they essentially become the establishment. So, number two, their content is often made up of negatives. So whether it's, anti-politics, anti-intellectualism, anti-elite, or, anti-news media, for example, populists will often capitalize on negatives. Now, this is because negative rhetoric towards the enemy further separates the people and the elite, ultimately causing the elite to appear dangerous and unsupportive of the wills of the people. The last thing I'm going to point to in terms of how to spot a populist is number three. So they behave in a way that is not typical of politicians. So sometimes, in an effort to appear sort of closer to the people and attach themselves from the image of the elite, they will act or behave in a way that isn't typical of politicians. And, I think we could think of countless examples where Trump has sort of embodied this non-typical politician attitude. So before we move on, you may also be wondering, who the elite are. Well, this is solely dependent on who the populist leader is, because in essence, populists typically represent the elite as the political, economic, cultural, and media establishment who place their own interests and often the interests of others, such as, large corporations, foreign countries, or immigrants, above the interests of the people. So if we look at Trump, his version of the elite is embodied by the Democrats and the news media, etc. Also those who supposedly take opportunity away from the people. So, for example, immigrants, or in Trump's case, more specifically, Mexicans. Basically, the elite is the people's enemy, who are generally depicted as being out of touch with the wills of the people. So you now may be asking, who is the people? Well, this notion of the people changes depending on the populist, but it can be based along, class, ethnic, or national lines. Populism often entails presenting the people as the underdog. And again, going back to Trump's case, the people are generally, conservative white people, but not necessarily the working class, which we'll sort of get into. Populist leaders like Trump typically seek to reveal to the people how they're oppressed. And essentially, when we speak of the people throughout this video, we're talking about Trump's support base and the people that he generally speaks to when he says the people. So, populism, by definition, is a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel their concerns are disregarded by established elite groups. The people? Well, the people are the group the populist leader wants to appeal to, generally depicted as the underdog. And lastly, the elite. The elite are those out of touch / working against the interests of the people, and in practice, typically are those who stand in the way of the populist. So now that we've done the recap and gotten all of the basics out of the way, let's start with part one. So, Trump's rise. How did Trump rise to power in 2016? So I'm going to break this section up into two parts. So firstly, we're going to look at how populism interacted with his campaign style in the lead up to 2016. And then we're going to look at the political climate that allowed his populist campaign to succeed. So let's go back in time and revisit Trump's campaign for the 2016 election. So firstly, what were his campaign promises? Well, there were two main pillars to his campaign that all circled back to greater job opportunities for the American people. Trump campaigned on the understanding that popular hostility to liberal immigration and free trade policies would give him a seat in the White House. So, number one is his anti-immigration rhetoric. So, in his announcement speech, Trump promised to build a wall on the Mexican border, which would deport 11 million unauthorized immigrants. Another promise was to tear up free trade agreements and bring back manufacturing jobs to protect American workers, which is ironic because, in previous centuries, a lot of America's economic prosperity has actually been acquired from the determined integration of immigrant populations. So both anti-immigrant promises played directly into his populist agenda because they infer that his main interest was protecting the opportunities available to the people. Then we move on to number two. So, make America great again. Now, I think this slogan will forever mark Trump's 2016 campaign. And this aspect of Trump's campaign was predicated on the idea that he would be able to win through an appeal to those people who were disempowered by the system and felt overlooked by the elite. And, this is clearly evident when you just simply look at the slogan, Make America Great Again, because, if you're already happy with America, you don't need to make it great again, or sort of seek to undermine or change it. So I guess it's populist in the sense that, Trump was sort of depicting the system as being corrupt or sort of being out of touch with the wills of the people and aligning himself with the people to sort of make America great once again. So let's look at how he championed his campaign. So, firstly, his use of Twitter was, the first of its kind, really. And through his employment of the platform, he was able to break the fourth wall and appear closer to his support base. And secondly, through his rallies, he was able to galvanize his support base and rile them up to go out and vote. Much like the way sort of like sporting events, rile people up and have them chanting slurs against the opposition, Trump sort of emulated this energy and applied it to politics. And thirdly, Trump carried his campaign through the way he framed his opposition, Hillary Clinton. By capitalizing on the email scandal that took place in the lead up to the 2016 election, Trump was able to paint Hillary as a danger to the American people, molding her into the corrupt elite and accentuating the pure people and corrupt elite divide that populism thrives off of. So at these rallies, Trump had his followers chanting the statement, lock her up. And there was evidence of Trump also referring to her as the devil.
But he made a deal with the devil. She's the devil. He made a deal with the devil. It's true.
So, this made Trump look like the good guy. He was the one standing against deceit and corruption. He was the one standing up for the interests of the American people. And I think that this is a really good example to sort of just, clearly accentuate that divide between the people who are good and the corrupt elite who are bad. And especially in Hillary's case, because, the email scandal almost sort of exposed corruption or whatever, it definitely aligned her closer and sort of molded her, as I said, into that sort of typical image of the corrupt elite. So, in summary, that was Trump's campaign in the lead up to the 2016 election. Populism played a huge role in the way Trump framed his campaign and his execution. But what made it stick? How did the millionaire businessman resonate with so many people? Well, to answer this question, let's look at the political climate of the US in the lead up to the election. What factors helped set up the success of Trump's campaign? So number one, globalization. By definition, globalization is the process of integration among people and countries worldwide and has, accelerated due to advances in transportation and communication technology. Because the world is now, more connected than ever, technological advancements travel so much more quickly and has by extension created a world where experts are required to allow regular people to navigate these complex new systems. So, for example, because the economy is so complicated, we now need accountants to help us with our money troubles. And because cars have become so complex, we now, need expert mechanics to help fix these for us. The dad of someone I know actually left school to become a mechanic. And this would have been, a fair while before the 2000s. And they have been a mechanic for their entire life. But now, because cars have, all of these new technological features, even he, as an expert in cars himself, needs to send cars off to someone else to finalize the job. We are constantly relying on other people to navigate today's globalized world from the vantage point of the 21st century, which for many people who have previously been self-sufficient for the most part is really disempowering. Additionally, because of globalization and our open borders, a lot of jobs are being sent overseas because labour is cheaper. And this has meant that a lot of people have lost jobs. And a clear example of this in the US is the demise of the once industrial capitals, Michigan and Pennsylvania. So these places have now become Rust Belt states because they've, been left without work for so long. They have essentially, become rusty. People once working in these states have lost jobs to people in developing countries. And this has sort of allowed Trump's anti-immigration rhetoric to work so well. So how is all of this relevant to Trump and his populist campaign and agenda? Well, firstly, globalization has left many people feeling disempowered by the current system, increasing the likelihood that people will follow a campaign that is anti-elite. Secondly, because globalization has led many people to lose job opportunities to citizens in other countries, people have built up anger that really should be directed toward the government and companies that sent the work overseas, but instead they're directing this anger towards immigrants, again allowing Trump's anti-immigration rhetoric and America First rhetoric to work and stick so well with the people. And the second set of factors which helped set up the success of Trump's campaign was the US's rampant social reform. So number two, social progress. Over the past number of decades, we have seen incredible changes to society's attitudes towards race, the LGBTIQA+ community, women, Indigenous rights, and the list goes on. This movement towards what some would refer to as the left has caused conservatives and people who hold traditional values on the right to feel a built-up sense of anger towards the system which allowed this all to happen, making room and space for a conservative right-wing populist like Trump to succeed. In specific relation to Trump's campaign's success, I really want to deep dive into the progress made in relation to race. So, before Trump won the election in 2016, Obama had been in power, and an article by Ta-Nehisi Coates titled "The First White President" sort of inferred that the fact of a black president had insulted Trump personally. And this would make sense, as to why Trump, I don't know whether you remember, but he sort of questioned Obama's right to his claims of American status and, required or sort of asked him to, check his birth certificate and stuff like that. And I think that, with the White House Correspondents' Dinner that happened in 2011, this only intensified that sort of insult that Trump sort of felt.
Donald Trump is here tonight. Now, I know that he's taken some flack lately, but no one is happier, no one is prouder to put this birth certificate matter to rest than the Donald. And that's because he can finally get back to focusing on the issues that matter. Like, did we fake the moon landing? What really happened in Roswell? And where are Biggie and Tupac?
So Trump arrived in the wake of a black presidency, a black healthcare, and a black justice reform, which Trump, as president, could target for redemption and destruction. And as Coates says in his article, Trump was the first president whose entire political existence hinged on the fact of a black president. Now, this is all significant because race was actually more important to Trump's campaign than people think. When most people talk about why Trump was able to rise to power, they go immediately to that first point that I made about the Rust Belt states and sort of, its relationship to why Trump's promise for greater job opportunities sort of worked well. That's the narrative that people go to. But as it turns out, in a study of pre-election polling data, people who supported Trump had a higher mean household income than those who did not support Trump. I find this incredibly interesting. So this renders the answer to Trump's rise rather puzzling. But what people don't talk about as often is the correlation between whiteness and Trump support, where the study showed that the colour of one's skin was the best predictor for Trump support. And I quote, "If you tallied the popular vote of only America to derive the 2016 electoral votes, Trump would have defeated Clinton 389 to 81, with the remaining votes either toss-up or unknown." So that is incredibly significant, and sort of thinking about that, it makes sense as to why Trump was able to successfully declare himself the champion of the working class despite his millionaire fortune. So, in essence, society's progressive social reforms meant that a large group of people felt left behind by the current system and were angry with the way things were headed, sort of creating the space for a populist president like Trump to campaign their way to victory in the wake of a black presidency. While Trump didn't cause the polarization, he capitalized on it and exacerbated it. And this is a huge aspect of Trump's campaign. On top of these factors, the state of America's voting system is also designed in a way that is beneficial to a populist leader like Trump. So one of these factors is non-mandatory voting. Because politicians have to mobilize people to vote because it's not necessary to, politics becomes more extreme, rather than playing to the middle like politicians do in places where voting is compulsory, such as Australia. Populism thrives in such systems because it allows the candidate to create their own version of the people, rather than having to appeal to everyone broadly. They can sort of cherry pick and be a bit more specific. A second factor is gerrymandering. Because the US's electorates are manipulated to favour one party or class, it makes it easier for people like Trump to target states and tailor their campaigns. And a third factor is voter suppression. So in the US, it's not necessarily easy to vote, given people have to take time off work and compromise pay, meaning only those who have, either a lot of money to spare or a lot of motivation to vote will actively go out of their way to participate in the electoral system. Trump capitalised on the flaws of the US voting system and on the growing angst of the conservative and disempowered population of the US, strategically aligning himself with the people through clever campaigning. Now, he wasn't a career politician, and this worked in his favour, positioning himself closer to the people. And he used these factors to set the stage for his campaign's success, which by extension led to his victory in 2016.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody.
So, once Trump got into power, how did populism affect his term? How did populism interact with his key political decisions, his responses to scandals, and his perpetual campaign? Well, firstly, let's look at some of his policy decisions. So, one of his first policy decisions was the Muslim and refugee ban. So, almost immediately after his inauguration, Trump focused on his anti-immigration promises. On the 28th of January, President Trump issued an executive order blocking refugees and travellers with passports from 7 Muslim-majority countries, slamming the door on refugees. And another license to discriminate was the wall. So on a similar tone, a signature promise of President Trump's was to build, that big, beautiful wall between the US and Mexico. And just so you're aware, I'm being sarcastic. In January 2017, Trump signed the executive order to formally direct the US government to begin wall construction. Again, this was one of the first things Trump started work on after his inauguration. And just a third thing that we're going to look at is sort of Trump's politicization of the justice system. So while there are several decisions that we could look at, this is one that I really want to draw focus to. Because during his term, Trump put many of his own former political aides on the bench, sending these aides turned judges straight from Trump's White House to the bench. So we have Gregory Katsas, who advised Trump on some of the administration's cruelest anti-LGBTIQA+ policies. Another one of these individuals is Stephen Menashe. So he worked with Stephen Miller as the administration carried out anti-immigration policies that have since left children dead in the US and have turned away many individuals in need of help from American borders. And this isn't to mention, Judge Kavanaugh, where, there was heaps of discussion around him and his sexual assault accusations. And, then we have Ruth Bader Ginsburg's replacement, pro-life Amy Coney, all of whom are hardcore conservatives. And I'm sure that you can see sort of the danger with this because, if the judicial branch becomes sort of, really closely aligned to the legislative branch and the executive branch, then there's no one really to sort of have checks or act as a check on Parliament and those politicians. So essentially, corruption can sort of happen. And we definitely might see this in years to come, because it's already sort of started happening in aspects. So with respect to each of these decisions, Trump continued to champion his support for the interests of the people. And I think a good example of this is looking sort of into his response to criticism about his decisions around the judiciary. In response, Trump tweeted this: "Sorry, Chief Justice John Roberts, but you do indeed have Obama judges, and they have a much different point of view than the people who are charged with the safety of our country." So, in all scenarios, Trump painted those who opposed his anti-immigration and pro-conservative policies as the enemy, whose priority was not the safety of the people. And I find this interesting as well because it was almost his go-to. When someone opposed him or sort of was standing in his way, he'd throw that sort of anti-safety rhetoric towards them and sort of paint them as this, danger to society. And I think that's a really interesting tactic on his part. And again, it sort of flows into populism because it plays directly into that corrupt elite versus that pure people divide. So now let's turn to how Trump dealt with scandals. So, as I said, to say there were a few scandals during Trump's presidency would be a complete understatement. For the best part of those 3 years, Trump was, in a new scandal almost every 1 or 2 weeks. And I think that this could potentially work as a strategy of its own. So, with so many scandals to keep up with, it's almost like the meaning of each of them individually was sort of rendered less significant. But the first scandal that we're going to look at really quickly is the Mueller report. So the Mueller report is the official document reporting the findings and conclusions of Robert Mueller's investigation into Russian efforts to interfere with the 2016 presidential election. So, how did Trump fight back? Well, Trump dealt with his scandal by denying allegations and claiming to be the victim of the single greatest witch hunt of a politician in American history. And I find this quite interesting because, he was the candidate who called for a foreign power to hack his opponent, Hillary's email, and is now, as president, claiming to be the victim of the single greatest witch hunt of a politician in American history. A little bit ironic. Secondly, we have Donald Trump's impeachment trials. So, in 2019/2020, Trump faced allegations that he was seeking help from the Ukrainian authorities to favor him in the 2020 US presidential election. How did Trump fight back? Well, Trump dealt with his scandal by also claiming the whole case against Donald Trump was a political witch hunt. Again. And he also claimed that this was an act of political vengeance. So these are both key examples of how populism played into his dealings with scandals. When he was called out for wrongdoings, he would attempt to continue aligning himself with the people by painting himself as the victim of the corrupt elite. And by sort of referring and connotating sort of the opposition going after him like a witch hunt, it sort of rendered the things that he actually had done that were quite bad and the allegations that he was facing that were quite serious into something that sort of almost appeared frivolous to his supporters. And, during Trump's time as president, he faced so many scandals in relation to his poor treatment of women and his white supremacist agenda. And I think a huge reason why he was able to survive these scandals was because the people supporting Trump either didn't really care or believed the same things he was sort of being exposed for saying. So I guess for a president whose most significant indicator of support is whiteness, being called out for telling the Proud Boys, the white supremacist group, to stand back and stand by only substantiates his position as a white supremacist himself even further, painting him as the person his leaders sort of follow him for in the first place. So populism evidently played a huge role in his decisions as president and his responses to scandals. And he worked very hard to uphold his image as part of the people. So what led to his loss in 2020? Well, firstly, populism is a great way to gain power, but a poor strategy to maintain it. It's easy to vocalize populist rhetoric when you're positioned as one of the people and don't have a seat in the White House, but it's increasingly difficult to unalign yourself from the elite when you have been the elite for 3 years. It's difficult to continue successfully fighting the elite when you're essentially in the enemy's chair. Additionally, Trump lacked a fresh message. So his 2020 election campaign was nothing new. Greater jobs, less taxes, anti-immigration. His populist campaign didn't work a second time around when he had already been in a position to make these changes for an entire term. So I think a second aspect to Trump's downfall was his handling of the coronavirus. So with localized exceptions such as Hurricane Maria, Trump didn't face any crisis that weren't of his own making until 2020. Now, in his handling of the coronavirus, Trump routinely dismissed or politicized advice from his own health agencies and demonized experts like Dr. Fauci like a true populist, and even took a step back from the World Health Organization. Hundreds of thousands of people died under Trump's watch. And, there were people who appreciated the liberty that Trump gave them, in terms of the fact that they could make their own decisions about the handling of the pandemic. But a lot of people, especially those that had been, impacted firsthand by coronavirus, which, at that stage, a lot of people had, it seemed irresponsible. And it sort of felt like he didn't truly value the people as much as he voiced that he did. And I guess in relation to Biden, while he didn't necessarily come across as the most exciting candidate, at least he seemed to actually care about the health and safety of the US population.
Yes, this is the President of the entire United States.
Hi, it's Stan Marsh.
Stan Marsh? Where's Mr. Slave?
I'm sorry we had to get your attention. Listen, we're being kept at the school, and one of the students here is really sick.
Oh, for Pete's sake, here we go again. Just deal with it, I am busy.
No, Mr. President, please. You gotta come back to South Park. Our teachers are shooting people. Everyone's arguing, and there's a facility outside of town that found the pangolin and are working on a vaccine. You might be able to stop the pandemic.
Why would I do that?
And a third aspect of Trump's downfall, I think, comes down to the fact that Trump's behavior actually galvanized people to vote. So voter turnout last year is estimated to be the highest in 120 years of US history. In Hawaii, turnout rose from 42.3% in 2016 to 57% last year. In Utah, turnout increased by about 11 percentage points, from 56.8% in 2016 to nearly 68% in 2020. And so what this data is indicative of is the fact that Trump's behavior over the past 3 years motivated non-Trump advocates to go out and vote or vote by postal votes. While Biden mightn't have been, again, the most exciting candidate, he wasn't Trump. And for many people, this was enough for people to vote for him. So then came 2020 and Biden took the election. So what comes next for Trump and populism in the United States? Well, as for Trump, his Twitter account has been banned, so he doesn't really have that same direct line of communication to his supporters as he did before. But this doesn't mean his support base aren't still believers of the rhetoric he spouted while in power. There will continue to be a high degree of skepticism when it comes to the media, and there will also likely continue to be people who believe the electoral system is rigged, and that the Democrats are the spawn of the devil. Additionally, Trump was really powerful for the Republican image, so irrespective of whether he comes back in the flesh, his legacy will continue to live on and influence politics for many years to come. And as for populism, the future seems interesting. It appears that for populist rhetoric to succeed, there has to be people that don't feel heard by the current system. People don't need America to be great again if it's already great. One of the promises of democracy is that leaders will represent and uphold the views of the people. But a lot of the time, it can feel like politicians are out of touch, and this goes for people on both the left and the right. There has been progress towards greater inclusion and acceptance of minorities, leading conservatives to feel overlooked. And now there has been regression in relation to abortion laws and racial inclusion, where the environment is just a constant afterthought, leading young people and progressives to also feel overlooked. Democracy isn't working the way it was intended, but is populism the solution? Well, insofar as democracy continues to operate like an exclusive elite, I tend to believe that populists will continue to emerge. Whether or not they will be successful is still yet to be determined, but judging from, their populist predecessor, I would not discount it. So, that concludes my discussion on Trump and populism, and I just want to say thank you so much for tuning in to this week's video. If you enjoyed, please be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future videos, and hopefully I will catch you next time. Thanks for watching, and enjoy your day wherever you are in the world. Thank you.